The millionaire's autistic son mysteriously vanishes from the mansion during the night. After more than 24 hours of desperate searching, the police finally found him. What the father discovered about who was really taking care of his son changed everything forever. The afternoon sunbeam sliced through the air of the immense bedroom, illuminating dust particles that danced like tiny diamonds suspended in time. On the floor, sitting on a soft-piled Persian rug, 8-year-old Theo stacked wooden blocks with a concentration that insulated him from the rest of the world. His movements were precise, repetitive, a sacred ritual no one dared to interrupt, no one except Lara. At 7 years old, her hair in 2 thin pigtails that swung with every move, she was the only person in Theo's universe permitted entry. She didn't speak, didn't ask. She simply sat beside him in a knowing silence and handed him the next block, always the blue one, exactly when his small hand searched for it, his eyes never needing to leave the growing tower. It was a silent dance, a wordless conversation they had invented and that only they understood. Lara's mother, Anna, was vacuuming in the hallway, the distant hum serving as the soundtrack to this fragile piece, built inside a mansion that, for all its grandeur, felt cold and empty. Lara had been accompanying her mother to this job for nearly 6 months. At first, she'd been intimidated by the high ceilings, the abstract art on the walls that seemed to stare down at her, and the echo of her own footsteps on the marble floors. But then, she met Theo. She saw the loneliness in his eyes, a solitude as vast as the mansion's halls, and her young heart, gifted with an extraordinary and natural empathy, felt a calling. Day by day, with the patience of someone tending a rare flower, she drew closer. She would leave one of her toys near him. Then she would sit a little closer until the day he, for the first time, accepted a block from her hand. To Theo's father, Richard, a man whose life was governed by stock charts and the fluctuations of the Dow, his son's improvement was an inexplicable miracle. He watched the children's interactions on the security cameras he monitored from his office, a sanctuary of glass and steel where he turned numbers into more fortune. He saw his son, who had never connected with expensive therapists or specialized tutors, smile. A genuine smile, brought on by the daughter of his housekeeper. That day, however, a shadow fell across the bedroom doorway. Beatrice, Richard's wife, observed the scene with a gaze that held not a trace of warmth. Her thin lips were pressed into a hard line. She saw the same scene as her husband, but her interpretation was radically different. She didn't see the purity of friendship, but a usurpation. This little girl, with her simple clothes and easy smile, was achieving something she, with all her money and status, never had. Theo's genuine affection. The boy was, to her, part of the package, a complex piece of the estate she had acquired through marriage, and his affection, in her distorted view, was a valuable asset being diverted into the wrong hands. Jealousy gnawed at her, a slow, bitter poison that mingled with her greed. She could not allow such a deep connection to blossom between the heir to all of this and the daughter of a hired hand. It was improper, dangerous, a subtle threat to her long-term plans. She took a step back, retreating into the dimness of the hall, and a cold, sharp idea, like a shard of glass, began to form in her mind. Theo's smile, so rare and precious, had just sealed the fate of Lara and her mother. Beatrice now knew exactly what she needed to do to sever that bond at the root, and she would do it without hesitation and without mercy. Beatrice slid open the frosted glass door of her walk-in closet, a luxury sanctuary where designer clothes hung in perfect rows like soldiers awaiting orders. The air was scented with an expensive blend of cedar and lavender. She wasn't there to choose an outfit, but to execute the first step of her cruel plan. Her eyes, cold and calculating, scanned her husband's accessory shelves, which shared a portion of the cavernous space. Richard was a man of habit, meticulous with his business, with his vast portfolio, but somewhat careless with his personal belongings, trusting blindly in the order that surrounded him. It was this trust Beatrice decided to exploit. Her hand, adorned with a diamond ring that would cost Anna a lifetime of work to afford, hovered over a blue velvet box. With her fingertips, she opened it. Inside rested a pair of solid gold cufflinks, delicately engraved with a family crest. They were an heirloom. One of the few objects that connected Richard to a past, before the overwhelming fortune, before capital, became the only language he seemed to speak fluently. With a quick, silent movement, she pocketed the cufflinks and slipped them into her silk robe. Later that day, while Anna was meticulously dusting Richard's office, Beatrice entered under the pretense of looking for a book. She watched the housekeeper for a moment, her honest, tired face, and felt a pang of contempt. How could anyone find satisfaction in such a small life? Anna, oblivious to the venomous stare, smiled briefly at her employer before returning to her work. That innocent smile only hardened Beatrice's resolve. Today was Anna's workday. The coincidence would be perfect. Later, over dinner, she planted the first seed. "Darling," she began, her voice carefully calibrated to sound like casual concern, "don't you think we should be more careful? With so many people in and out of the house, things are so strange in the world these days." Richard barely looked up from his tablet, where stock market graphs flowed in rivers of green and red. "Security is top-notch, B. You know that," he murmured, more interested in the returns of a new hedge fund. "I know, but I don't know. It's a feeling. A woman's intuition, maybe." She let the sentence hang in the air, knowing that doubt, once planted, has stubborn roots. 2 days passed. Life in the mansion followed its course. Lara and Theo built ever taller castles. Anna scrubbed floors until they gleamed like mirrors. And Richard closed a multi-million-dollar deal that added a few more zeros to his net worth. On Friday morning, he had an important meeting. As he dressed, he went to his closet, opened the blue velvet box, and found it empty. He frowned, he checked a drawer, then another. He sifted through the small boxes where he kept watches and other accessories. Nothing. An irritation began to bubble inside him. The small disruption in his perfectly organized routine bothered him deeply. He couldn't remember the last time he'd worn them. His mind, always occupied with cash flow and asset management, didn't register such details. Then his wife's words echoed in his mind. With so many people in and out, he shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was absurd, but the seed of suspicion had already begun to sprout. He walked out of the closet and called for his wife, his voice louder than usual, cutting through the morning silence of the house. "Beatrice, have you seen my gold cufflinks, the ones from my grandfather?" Beatrice entered the closet, her face a mask of perfectly rehearsed concern. "My cufflinks, the gold ones, from your grandfather?" she asked, her voice laced with the exact right amount of surprise and alarm. "Honey, are you sure? Did you look properly?" Richard ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration that had become more frequent lately. "Of course I've looked, Beatrice. I've searched everywhere. They've just vanished." He hated disorder, unpredictability. In his world of business, he controlled every variable, analyzed every risk, turning capital into more capital with surgical precision. His fortune wasn't built on chance, but on pillars of logic and absolute control. Losing a sentimental object within his own fortress was more than an annoyance. It was a system failure, a breach in his armor. Beatrice touched his arm gently. "Calm down, my love. We'll look together later. They must be around here, unless..." She paused, letting the insinuation hang in the air like toxic smoke. "Unless what?" he pressed, already irritated. "Nothing. I don't even want to think about it. It must just be a mistake." The following week passed under a new layer of tension. invisible to everyone but Richard. He found himself watching Anna more closely, analyzing her gestures, searching for something he didn't even know what it was. He felt foolish for it. Anna was efficient, discreet, and her face conveyed an honesty that would disarm anyone. Besides, Theo's joy was an incalculable dividend from Lara's presence in their home. How could he suspect the mother of the girl who made his son smile? He tried to forget about it, classifying it as his own carelessness. But the next Friday, Beatrice's plan entered its second phase. In the afternoon, while Anna cleaned the master suite, Beatrice staged a small drama. She let out a restrained cry from her closet. Richard rushed in to find her standing with her hand over her mouth. Her eyes wide with feigned horror, fixed on her open jewelry box. "What is it?" he asked, his heart already racing. "My bracelet," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My diamond bracelet, the one you gave me for our anniversary. It's gone." This time, the blow was harder. It wasn't just an object of sentimental value. It was a significant investment, a piece that represented part of their immense wealth. Richard felt his blood run cold. 2 Fridays in a row. 2 valuable items missing. The coincidence was brutal, impossible to ignore. "I don't want to accuse anyone, my love. I really don't." Beatrice began to cry, perfectly timed tears streaming down her face. "But did you notice it's Friday? The last time I wore the bracelet was Wednesday. And last Friday, your cufflinks disappeared. It's always on the day she cleans our room." She didn't have to say the name. The ensuing silence was heavy, freighted with an implicit accusation that poisoned the air of the mansion. Later, from his office, Richard looked out the panoramic window. In the garden, Lara was teaching Theo how to tie his shoelaces. Her patience was infinite, her movements gentle, and the concentration on Theo's face was absolute. When he finally managed a clumsy bow, they both burst into a pure, crystalline laugh that Richard could almost hear through the soundproof glass. The scene was an oasis of innocence in the desert of suspicion forming in his mind. The conflict tore him apart. His son's happiness was right there in front of him, personified in that little girl. But the evidence was circumstantial, yet compelling. He, the man who trusted data and facts, was being guided by a current of emotional manipulation. He turned from the window, his face a mask of cold determination. Uncertainty was a luxury he could no longer afford. He looked at Beatrice, who was watching him with expectant eyes. "The next time she comes," he said, his voice hard as steel, "I'll empty her bag myself on her way out." The third Friday arrived like a verdict awaiting its sentence. The air in the mansion was thick, charged with an electricity that Lara, with her childlike sensitivity, felt immediately. Mr. Ashford, who usually gave her a distant nod, avoided her completely today, his face set in a stern expression that frightened her. Theo felt the shift too. He refused to leave his room, remaining curled up in his armchair, rocking gently, a behavior he only exhibited when he felt anxious or threatened. Lara tried to approach with her wooden blocks, the peace offering that always worked, but he just shook his head without looking at her. The little girl's heart ached. For the first time, the silent bridge between them seemed to have been dynamited. She didn't understand why. She only knew that her friend was hurting and that somehow she was the cause. Her mother Anna's workday dragged on. She felt Beatrice's eyes on her, a constant, heavy gaze, as if she were being watched. Anna tried to ignore it, focusing on her tasks, hoping the day would end soon so she could take her daughter away from the oppressive atmosphere. Meanwhile, Beatrice executed the final blow, discreetly. She took one of Richard's expensive watches, a gold model he rarely wore, but which represented a considerable investment in his portfolio of luxury goods. With her heart beating fast, not with fear, but with a cruel excitement, she slipped into the service area where Anna had left her purse hanging on a hook. The bag was simple, made of worn canvas, with a small flower keychain made by Lara. With practiced speed, Beatrice opened the zipper, pushed the watch to the bottom, between a wallet and a pack of tissues, and left without a sound. She had won. The trap was set. The bait was placed. All that was left was to wait for the moment of humiliation. At the end of the afternoon, as Anna and Lara were preparing to leave, Richard came down the stairs. His expression was so cold it seemed to freeze the air around him. Beatrice was right behind, her face a mask of false sorrow. "Anna, a moment, please," Richard said, his voice flat. Anna stopped, Lara's hand in hers. "Yes, Mr. Ashford. Over the past few weeks, some valuable items have disappeared from this house. Coincidentally, always on the days you are here," he said, the words landing like stones. Anna turned pale. The shock on her face was so genuine that for a second, Richard's certainty wavered. "Sir, I wouldn't do that. I would never," she stammered, horror growing in her eyes. Beatrice intervened, her voice as smooth as venom. "No one is accusing you, Anna. We just want to clear things up. Please, would you mind showing us what's in your bag?" The humiliation of the request was like a slap in the face. Anna felt tears sting her eyes, but her dignity kept her upright. She had nothing to hide. With trembling hands, she opened her bag and began to place its contents on a small coffee table, the wallet with a few dollars, the old cell phone, her house keys, and then her hand touched cold, heavy metal. She pulled out the gold watch, staring at it as if it were a snake. The silence that followed was deafening. Lara looked from her mother to the watch, not understanding, fear growing in her chest. "I don't know how this got here," Anna whispered, her voice broken. "I swear, Mr. Ashford, I swear on my daughter's life." But Richard was no longer listening. The proof was there, gleaming under the chandelier's light. An irrefutable condemnation. He looked at Beatrice, whose gaze said, "I told you so," and then at the housekeeper, whose face was now bathed in desperate tears. The affection he felt for the joy she indirectly brought his son was obliterated by the fury of betrayal. "I want you out of my house, now," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous, "and never come back." The dismissal was an act of cold brutality. Richard's words, "and they never come back," echoed through the lavish hall, ricocheting off the marble walls and embedding themselves in Anna's heart like shards of glass. She could barely breathe, the injustice of the accusation suffocating her. She took Lara's hand, which was shaking uncontrollably, and pulled her toward the door, not even gathering her belongings from the table, leaving behind the forged proof of her supposed crime. It was then that a sharp, desperate cry tore through the mansion's heavy silence. "Lara, no!" Theo was at the top of the staircase, his face contorted in an anguish he rarely showed so explicitly. His eyes, which usually avoided direct contact, were fixed on the girl, pleading. He never called her by name. That single word, ripped from his inner world, was a testament to the depth of his despair. Lara stopped, turning to him, her eyes flooded with tears. She wanted to run, to climb the stairs and tell him everything would be okay, that she'd be back tomorrow to build a new tower. But Richard's hard stare was an insurmountable wall. Anna pulled her daughter more forcefully, the instinct to protect overriding her own pain. "Come on, sweetie, let's get out of here." Beatrice moved toward Theo, trying to embrace him, but he pushed her away with surprising strength. "No, Lara," he cried again, his voice cracking. As he watched the front door close, swallowing his only friend, the door clicked shut, muffling the sound of the boys' sobs and sealing the fate of their friendship. The walk to the bus stop seemed to last an eternity. Lara sobbed quietly, her face buried in her mother's skirt. "Why, Mommy? Why is Mr. Ashford mad? What did we do?" Anna had no answers. How could you explain malice, calculated cruelty, to a 7-year-old? She just held her daughter tightly, whispering words of comfort. She couldn't believe herself. The humiliation burned inside her. The feeling of powerlessness was crushing. She had lost not only her job, her small source of income, but also her honor. In the days that followed, life in the mansion transformed. Silence returned to reign, but now it was a heavy, sick silence. Theo locked himself in his room and refused to come out. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak, wouldn't touch his blocks. The tower he and Lara had built on the day of the firing remained intact in the middle of the room, a monument to lost happiness. He just sat in his armchair, staring at the door, as if expecting Lara to walk through it at any moment, with her gentle smile and a blue block in her hand. Richard, initially relieved to have solved the problem, began to feel a growing unease. The joy had been drained from his house, and the void left behind was palpable. He tried to convince himself it was a phase, that Theo would adapt. He hired the best specialists who came with their clipboards and theories, but none of them could elicit a single reaction from the boy. Money, which had always been the solution for everything in his life, for the first time proved utterly useless. He could buy anything in the world, from rare stocks to private islands, but he couldn't buy back his son's smile. A week after the dismissal, the situation reached a critical point. The head housekeeper called Richard in the middle of a meeting about a new company acquisition, her voice trembling with panic. "Sir, it's Theo. He hasn't eaten anything since yesterday, and now he has a fever. He won't let us near him." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. He cancelled all his appointments and rushed home. He found his son exactly as the housekeeper had described, huddled in the armchair, pale, his lips dry and cracked, shivering under a blanket. The family doctor was called and diagnosed a severe depressive episode, exacerbated by dehydration and refusal to eat. The boy's sorrow was so overwhelming, it was making his body sick. That night, sitting on the edge of his son's bed, watching him sleep a restless sleep, Richard felt like the poorest man in the world. All his wealth, all his assets, seemed like dust and ashes in the face of the silent pain consuming the child. And deep in his soul, a terrible doubt began to surface. What if he had made a mistake? What if, in his haste to protect his material possessions, he had destroyed the most precious asset his son had ever possessed? Anna and Lara's home was the exact opposite of the mansion. A small, two-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood, where the sound of the street mixed with the neighbor's television. The walls were thin, the furniture simple and second-hand, but the space was filled with a warmth the mansion had never known. However, since the firing, a cloud of sadness hung over their small home. Anna spent her days searching for a new job, her face etched with worry. The humiliation still haunted her, and the fear of how she would pay the bills at the end of the month was a constant knot in her stomach. Lara, for her part, had withdrawn. The cheerful, talkative girl had become quiet and reserved. She missed Theo with an overwhelming ache, a physical pain in her chest. She drew pictures of block towers on scraps of paper, always leaving an empty space at the very top. It was his spot, the spot no one else could fill. "Mommy, do you think Theo is okay?" she would ask every night before bed. And every night Anna would hug her and say, "I'm sure he is, honey. He has his father to take care of him." But deep down, Anna had her doubts. She had seen the connection between the two children, a bond that transcended words. She knew Lara's absence would be a terrible blow to the boy, but what could she do? She was branded, accused. Richard's family was powerful. His name was gold in the business world. Her word, the word of a housekeeper, was worth nothing. Her own parents, Lara's grandparents, advised her to forget the whole thing. "Don't mess with rich people, honey." Her father, a simple man who'd worked his whole life in a factory, had said, "They can destroy you. Think about your daughter. Stay away from them." The fear of retaliation was real. A theft accusation, even without concrete proof, could tarnish her name forever, making it difficult to find any job. For Lara's safety, she had to stay away. This prohibition became Lara's first great obstacle. Her mother, the person she trusted most, now forbade her from even mentioning Theo's name. "We can't talk about them anymore, Lara. It's for our own good," Anna would say, with a firmness that broke the little girl's heart. Lara didn't understand the complexities of the adult world, the issues of power, money, and reputation. She only understood the language of friendship and loyalty, and in her heart, she felt she was abandoning her friend when he needed her most. She felt guilty, helpless. Her family's prohibition, born of fear and prudence, was a prison to Lara. She wanted to help, wanted to fix whatever was broken, but her small hands were tied. Meanwhile, in the mansion, Richard's desperation deepened. Theo wasn't getting better. The boy seemed to be wasting away before his eyes, losing what little interest he had in the world. He would spend hours staring out his bedroom window in the direction of the road, leading away from the property's gates, as if waiting for a miracle. Richard felt like a monumental failure. He was a titan in the financial world, a multi-millionaire whose decisions influenced the market, moving enormous cash flows and generating astronomical profits. But inside his own home, before his only son, he was completely powerless. Guilt gnawed at him. The image of Anna's shocked and wounded face, swearing her innocence on her daughter's life, came back to haunt him in his sleepless nights, and Theo's cry, calling for Lara, was a constant echo in his mind. Beatrice tried to console him, blaming the girl's obsessive influence for their son's crisis. "He needs to detach, darling. It's a painful process, but a necessary one. He needs to learn to relate to people on our level." Her words, which had once seemed logical, now sounded hollow and cruel. He was beginning to see through the facade, to sense the coldness behind the staged concern, but the truth was so monstrous that his mind refused to fully accept it. The house, which should have been a refuge, had become a mausoleum for his son's happiness, and he was the one responsible for having locked the door and thrown away the key. The second week after Lara's departure dragged on, like a wound that refuses to heal. Each day in the mansion was a grey copy of the last, marked by the oppressive silence emanating from Theo's room. Richard cancelled business trips, postponed meetings about cryptocurrency investments, and began working from home, a decision that only plunged him deeper into the desolate atmosphere. He tried everything. He bought the most expensive, high-tech toys, brought home pets that were promptly ignored, hired storytellers and musicians. Nothing. Theo remained in his cocoon of sadness, indifferent to all stimuli. It was as if the color had been drained from his world, leaving only shades of gray. Lara's absence was a black hole that sucked away all light and joy. That Thursday night, a storm broke over the city. Rain lashed against the mansion's armored windows, and thunder rumbled like the roar of a distant beast. Richard, exhausted, finally managed to get Theo to drink some soup and put him to bed. The boy seemed more fragile than ever, the low-grade fever stubbornly persisting. Richard sat in his office, the computer screen displaying complex investment fund charts that for the first time in his life, held no interest for him. What was the point of accumulating so much wealth if the person for whom he was building this empire was slowly fading away? The question haunted him until exhaustion won, and he fell asleep in his leather armchair, the sound of the rain a sad lullaby. He awoke to the shrill sound of the main gate's alarm. It was 4 in the morning. Richard's heart pounded. He looked at the security monitor, expecting to see an intruder, but what he saw turned his blood to ice. The gate was open, wide open. A system failure. He ran upstairs, panic rising in his throat. He pushed open the door to Theo's room. The bed was empty. The blanket was tossed on the floor. The bedroom window was ajar, the curtain billowing with the damp wind that swept in. Theo was gone. Panic gave way to absolute, cold, white terror. He screamed his son's name, running through the dark corridors, flipping on all the lights, the sound of his own voice echoing back at him, empty and desperate. He woke Beatrice, who seemed more annoyed than worried, and the staff. They searched every inch of the mansion and the vast grounds. Nothing. Theo was nowhere. The boy, who barely left his room, who was afraid of loud noises and open spaces, had gone out alone, in the middle of the night, during a thunderstorm. The idea was so absurd, so terrifying, that Richard could hardly process it. He called the police, his voice breaking, trying to remain calm as he reported the disappearance of his 8-year-old autistic son. With every passing minute, his desperation morphed into a physical agony. He imagined Theo lost, scared, soaked by the rain, alone. The image was unbearable. The police arrived quickly, the flashing lights of their patrol cars painting the mansion walls blue and red, turning the scene into a vivid nightmare. As he answered the detective's questions, a memory hit him with the force of a punch. He remembered Theo, weeks ago, spending hours on his tablet, staring intently at a map of the city. At the time, he'd thought it was just another of his peculiar interests. But now, a terrible and yet incredibly lucid possibility began to form in his mind. What had Theo been looking for on that map with such intensity? What if he hadn't just run away, but was going somewhere, a specific place? A place where he believed he would find his only refuge. The hours that followed were a blur of anguish for Richard. The mansion, normally a bastion of order and silence, transformed into a chaotic command center. Police officers came and went, search dogs combed the drenched gardens, and the phone rang incessantly with updates that never brought the news he longed to hear. Beatrice played the role of the distraught mother for the TV news cameras already gathering outside the gates. But in private, her nervousness seemed more focused on the negative exposure the incident would bring to her business and social status than on Theo's well-being. Richard, however, was in his own private hell. Guilt was a crushing weight on his chest. Every decision he'd made, every harsh word he'd spoken, replayed in his mind in a torturous loop. He had cast out the only light in his son's life, and as a result, Theo had fled into the darkness. Meanwhile, miles away, in the small apartment in the working-class neighborhood, Lara woke up in the middle of the night. She couldn't say what had roused her. A sound, a dream. She sat up in bed and felt a chill run down her spine, a strange feeling that something was wrong. That's when she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible noise from the front door, a scratch followed by a low moan. Fear paralyzed her for an instant, but it was replaced by a stronger curiosity. Silently, she slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the door. She looked through the peephole, but saw nothing. The sound came again, closer to the floor. Her heart pounding, she turned the knob and opened the door, just a crack. On the threshold, huddled and trembling, was Theo. He was completely soaked, his thin pajamas clinging to his skin, his hair dripping. His lips were blue, and he was shivering violently, not just from the cold, but from exhaustion. In his hand, he clutched a small, blue wooden block. Lara gasped. Without a second thought, she threw the door open and pulled him inside. "Theo! What are you doing here? How did you get here?" He didn't answer, just looked at her, his eyes filled with a relief so profound it seemed to ache. He then collapsed onto the floor, his small body finally succumbing to the superhuman effort he had made. Lara, seized by a protective panic, ran to wake her mother, Anna. Seeing the boy on her living room floor, felt the world spin. The son of the man who had humiliated and accused her was here, in her apartment, sick and vulnerable. Her first instinct was to call the police, to call Richard himself. But when she saw her daughter's face, the expression of pure love and concern, as she tried to cover Theo with a small blanket, she hesitated. The boy had walked for miles, alone in the middle of a storm, searching for the only person in the world he trusted. How could she send him back to the place that had broken him? Anna's internal struggle was overwhelming. The fear of getting into more trouble with that powerful family paralyzed her. Her father's words echoed in her mind, "Stay away from them." But her mother's heart saw only a sick child who needed help. Theo's fever was high. He started murmuring disconnectedly, Lara's name the only clear word. Anna and Lara got him into Lara's bed, removed his wet clothes, and wrapped him in every blanket they owned. Anna made some warm broth, and Lara, with infinite patience, began to feed it to him, spoonful by spoonful. She spoke to him in whispers, telling him stories about block towers that reached the clouds, and slowly, under her care, Theo's shivering began to subside. Anna watched the scene, her heart torn between fear and admiration. Her daughter, so small and fragile, possessed a strength and compassion that she herself struggled to find. In that moment, Anna made a decision. She would take care of this boy, at least for tonight. The police, Richard, the world, it could all wait. Here, in this small room, all that mattered was the unbreakable bond between two children. A bond that neither distance, nor anger, nor injustice had managed to destroy. The next morning brought a pale sun and a harsh reality. The news of the disappearance of multimillionaire Richard Ashford's son was on every news channel. Theo's picture, a formal portrait in which he looked uncomfortable and distant, flashed on Anna's small television screen. Reporters were camped outside the mansion, speculating about kidnapping and asking for information. Anna felt a chill. The boy the media was desperately searching for was asleep in her daughter's bed, still feverish, but finally at peace. Fear returned with full force. She wasn't a kidnapper. She had just taken in a sick child who showed up at her door. But how would the world see it? How would Richard, a man who already considered her a thief, react when he discovered his son had been here all along? The possibility of being accused of something far more serious terrified her. Lara seemed oblivious to these worries. Her only mission was to care for Theo. She placed damp cloths on his forehead, told him the same stories over and over, and held his hand. To her, the situation was simple. Her friend was sick and needed her. Nothing else mattered. Theo's intelligence, often underestimated because of his communication difficulties, revealed itself in an astonishing way. In the pocket of his wet pajamas, Anna found a crumpled piece of paper. It was a printout from an online map, with a route clearly marked in red pen. From the mansion to the address of their apartment building. The boy, in his silent desperation, had planned his escape with remarkable precision. He had memorized the route, every street, every corner. He had faced the darkness, the rain, and the fear, driven by a single certainty. At the end of that path, Lara would be waiting. The discovery touched Anna deeply, dissolving the last remnants of her hesitation. This was not the act of a lost child. It was an act of love and determination. The police search intensified. Teams spread across the city, checking parks, hospitals, and shelters. Richard's name, synonymous with power and influence, mobilized massive resources. His wealth, which gave him access to almost anything, was now being used in a frantic hunt for his most valuable asset. Late in the afternoon, after more than 24 hours of anguish, a lead finally emerged. A late-night bus driver called the police, remembering he'd seen a small boy in pajamas walking alone in the rain on an avenue that connected the wealthy districts with the suburbs. The description was a perfect match. The police focused their search on that area, a working-class neighborhood of narrow streets and modest homes. They went door to door, showing Theo's picture. Finally, an elderly neighbor of Anna's, who had seen the little girl arrive with the soaked boy the night before, recognized the photo. "I think he's with Anna, the young woman in 302, she said, pointing to the simple building. The police arrival was discreet but efficient. 2 cars pulled up to the building. 2 detectives walked up the stairs, Anna's heart pounding uncontrollably as she heard the firm knock on her door. When she opened it, relief and fear mingled on her face. Richard arrived minutes later, his face a mask of exhaustion and fury. He pushed past Anna as if she didn't exist and stormed into the small apartment. His eyes swept over the modest surroundings with disdain until he stopped at the bedroom door. And then he saw it. The scene that unfolded before him stopped his heart. Theo was sitting up in bed, propped against pillows, while Lara, with the seriousness of a doctor, was feeding him soup with a spoon. "Just one more bite, Theo," she was whispering. "Do so you can get strong, and we can build a castle all the way to the ceiling." Theo, for the first time in weeks, opened his mouth and accepted the food, his eyes fixed on the girl with unquestionable adoration. The cramped apartment, as Richard saw it in his mind, the humble setting contrasted violently with the purity and love of the scene. The fury that had consumed him dissolved, replaced by an overwhelming wave of emotion that caught him completely by surprise. His knees felt weak. Here, in this poor room, his son was receiving a care that all his money, all his fortune could not buy. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, a statue in an expensive suit, his emotions at war. The anger that had propelled him here evaporated, leaving a void that was quickly filled by something he hadn't felt in a very long time, a crushing humility. He watched the interaction between the two children, the way Lara's hand wiped a dribble of soup from Theo's chin, the way his son's eyes followed her as if she were the sun. There was no fear here, no coercion. There was only pure, genuine, selfless care. Everything he wanted for his son was happening in that tiny, humble room, and he had absolutely nothing to do with it. On the contrary, he had done everything to stop it. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt. The mistake, the devastating, irreparable mistake he had made. It wasn't about the cufflinks, the bracelet, or the watch. It never was. It was about Beatrice's jealousy, about his own blindness, about his pride that had prevented him from seeing the truth right in front of him. His son's happiness wasn't an asset to be controlled, but a delicate flower that needed the right garden to bloom. And this small apartment, with all its love, was that garden. The tears he had been holding back for weeks finally came, silent and hot. He wept. The multi-millionaire, the business titan who showed no weakness, wept there, on the threshold of a suburban apartment, before a housekeeper he had humiliated and her daughter, who had saved his. Anna, who had been expecting screams and accusations, was stunned to see the man's vulnerability. The detectives, embarrassed, looked away. Lara and Theo, immersed in their own world, were the only ones who didn't notice the emotional storm unfolding in the doorway. Richard took a step forward, his voice choked. "Anna, forgive me." The words came out as a rough whisper, heavy with the weight of his guilt. I was a fool, a blind fool." In that instant, the power dynamic between them completely inverted. He was no longer the powerful employer. He was just a desperate father, begging for forgiveness. Beatrice's arrival minutes later shattered the moment of catharsis. She swept into the apartment like a hurricane, her face twisted in calculated fury. "I don't believe this," she exclaimed, ignoring her husband's emotional state. "They kidnapped him. They're exploiting a vulnerable child. I want you to arrest this woman now." Her voice was shrill, cutting, and finally got the children's attention. Theo flinched at the sound of her voice, instinctively moving closer to Lara, who shielded him with her arm, her brow furrowed in defiance. The boy's reaction was more eloquent than any words. He wasn't afraid of his supposed kidnappers. He was afraid of her. The lead detective, an experienced and observant man, intervened. "Ma'am, please, calm down. The situation doesn't appear to be what you're describing." But Beatrice didn't stop. "Can't you see? It's obvious. They're brainwashing him. These people, they just want our money." The crude accusation, spoken aloud, sounded absurd even to Richard. He looked at his wife, and for the first time, he saw her with crystal clarity. He saw the greed, The cruelty, the complete lack of empathy for the boy she called her son. The mask had fallen. The police investigation, which had begun as a standard procedure in the search for a missing child, now took a different turn. The detectives, returning to the mansion to gather more information, decided to conduct a full search, including places where stolen items might have been hidden. It was routine, but Beatrice's over-the-top reaction in the apartment had raised a red flag. And it was at the bottom of an old trunk in the rarely used attic, hidden under old linens, that they found everything. The gold cufflinks, the diamond bracelet, and the watch. Beatrice's elaborate deception had been exposed. The discovery of the items was the spark that ignited Beatrice's house of cards. The news reached the small apartment via a phone call to the detective, who listened to the report in silence, his gaze fixed on the millionaire's wife. When he hung up, the atmosphere shifted from tense to glacial. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, his voice now official and devoid of any deference, "we've found the items you reported missing. They were hidden in a trunk in your attic." Beatrice turned white. For an instant, shock shattered her composure. Her eyes widened in panic before she managed to reconstruct her mask of indignation. "That's absurd. She must have put them there. She obviously knew the house. She was planning this all along." But the accusation sounded desperate, illogical. No one believed her, not even Richard. For him, that revelation was the final piece of the puzzle, clicking into place with a painful, sickening finality. He remembered every insinuation, every venomous word, every fake tear. It had all been an act, a cruel manipulation designed to drive away Anna and Lara, the only people who threatened the control Beatrice wanted to exert over the family and, by extension, its vast fortune. The real obstacle was now clear. It was no longer about a theft accusation, but about a complex web of lies and psychological cruelty. Beatrice, cornered, went on the attack using the weapons she had left. "You can't take the word of a housekeeper over mine," she shrieked, her voice bordering on hysterical. "And what about the child's welfare? Look at this place. It's unsanitary. They're putting Theo's life at risk. I have the best lawyers. I will sue for kidnapping, for endangerment. I will take custody from you, Richard, if you side with them." The threat hung in the air, ugly and complicated. Legal issues of custody, child welfare, and criminal accusations began to overlap, creating a fog of confusion and fear. Anna, who had barely recovered from the shock of being exonerated, now faced the prospect of a legal battle against a rich and vindictive woman. Fear for her own daughter, for her future, began to torment her again. While the adults drowned in accusations and threats, Lara did something simple and powerful. She took Theo's hand, which was trembling from the shouting, and led him to a corner of the room, away from the turmoil. She opened her box of crayons and took out a piece of paper. "Let's draw, Theo," she whispered, creating a small bubble of peace in the midst of the chaos. "Let's draw our castle, really tall." And Theo, who hadn't touched a crayon in weeks, picked up the blue one and began to draw, his hand guided by the calming presence of his friend. That silent act of normalcy, of friendship, was more impactful than any shout. It showed everyone in the room where Theo's true safety, his true home, was. It wasn't in a cold mansion or in the middle of legal disputes, but at that little girl's side. It was then that the most devastating truth came to light, not through a confession, but through the cruel logic of the events themselves. Richard, watching his wife, who was now arguing heatedly with her lawyers on the phone, finally understood why. Beatrice had never loved Theo. She had never even liked him. The boy, with his special needs, was an inconvenient problem, an obstacle on her path to a life of luxury and freedom, without the responsibilities of motherhood she had never wanted. She had married Richard for his fortune, his status, his seemingly infinite capital. The son was an unwanted liability that came with the assets. Theo's connection with Lara wasn't just a source of jealousy, it was a direct threat, as it kept Richard emotionally tied to that house, that routine, that son. If Theo were miserable, perhaps Richard would agree to send him to a special care facility, far away from their lives, leaving Beatrice free to enjoy the inheritance and wealth unencumbered. Her plan was much darker than just framing a housekeeper. It was about erasing her son from the equation. The comprehension of this monstrosity left him breathless, his heart shattering into 1,000 pieces, not for the betrayal to him, but for the unimaginable cruelty directed at an innocent child. Anna's apartment became the stage for a silent war. On one side, Beatrice, phone pressed to her ear, spitting orders at her lawyers, her voice a venomous hum of litigation and threats. On the other, Lara and Theo, sitting on the floor, building a world of peace with paper and crayons, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. And in the center, Richard, paralyzed. He stood at the crossroads of his life, and both paths before him were terrifying. One path led to maintaining his marriage, a life of appearances socially respectable, where the scandal would be smothered by expensive settlements and carefully worded press releases. He would maintain the facade of the perfect family, protect his business's image, avoid public humiliation, but the price would be his son's soul. It would mean consigning Theo to a life with a woman who saw him as a burden, who had actively tried to destroy his only source of happiness. It would mean living a lie, knowing the woman who slept beside him was capable of a calculated cruelty that made him sick. The other path was the truth, a chaotic, painful, and publicly humiliating path. It would mean admitting to the world that his marriage was a sham, that he had been deceived, that he had failed miserably as a husband and, more importantly, as a father. It would mean dragging his family name through the mud, facing a litigious divorce that would surely be exploited by the media, exposing the guts of his private life for public consumption. It would be hell, but at the end of that path, maybe, just maybe, was the chance for redemption. The chance to give Theo the life he deserved, surrounded by real love, not convenience. The chance to look at himself in the mirror again without tasting the bitter shame. He looked at his son. Theo had drawn a clumsy figure next to his blue castle. 2 stick figures, one big and one small, holding hands, Richard and him. Even after everything, even after the neglect and the pain, in his son's world, they were still together. That simple drawing, made with the innocence of a child, was the knife that cut the knot of his indecision. What was his entire fortune, all his dividends, all his net worth, if he lost that? The answer was clear: nothing. The impossible choice suddenly became the only choice. Richard walked slowly over to Beatrice. She looked up, expecting him to announce his surrender, to take her side against these people. He took the phone from her hand and ended the call. "Beatrice," he began, his voice surprisingly calm, but with a steel resolve she had never heard before. "It's over." "What's over? Are you insane?" she hissed. "Our marriage, our lives together, everything. I want you to get your things and get out of my house. Today." The shock on her face was followed by a smirk of contempt. "You can't do that. We have a prenup, remember? I'll take half of everything. Half of your precious fortune. You can have it," Richard said, and the sincerity in his voice disarmed her. "You can have the money, the stocks, the assets, take it all, but you will not come near my son again. I will fight you with every last cent I have to make sure you never even have the right to speak his name again." He turned and walked over to Anna, who was watching the scene with wide eyes. He knelt before her, a gesture of humility that shocked everyone. "Anna, I have no words to say how sorry I am. What I did was unforgivable. But I'm asking you, please, help me fix this. Help me take care of my son. Come back, not as a housekeeper, as part of our family, please." Tears streamed down Anna's face. They were tears of relief, of validation, of a pain that was finally being acknowledged. She looked at Lara, who was now smiling at her, and then at Theo, who was looking at his father with a new light in his eyes, and she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, "we'll help." The resolution wasn't an explosion, but a gradual process of demolition and reconstruction. Beatrice's departure from the mansion was swift and cold, mediated by lawyers. The news of the billionaire's divorce and the accusations of false evidence and psychological cruelty leaked to the press, creating the media storm Richard had predicted. He faced the scandal head-on, issuing a single public statement in which he took full responsibility for his blindness and paternal neglect, asking for privacy for his family during a time of profound restructuring. He sold some stocks, liquidated a hedge fund to expedite the divorce settlement, treating the loss of part of his fortune not as a defeat, but as the necessary cost of buying his son's freedom and peace. Money, for the first time, was just a tool to undo a mistake, not to accumulate more power. Richard's first victory, however, was bittersweet. Rehiring Anna wasn't enough. He knew he had to repair the damage on a deeper level. A week after the confrontation in the apartment, he called her into his office, not the imposing city office, but the one at home, which now felt less like a financial command center and more like a worried father's room. "Anna," he began, What I did was more than unfair. It was inhuman. I stole your dignity, and no apology can erase that, but I want to try to do what's right." He offered her not a job, but a position. "I need someone I can trust to run this house, to make sure it's a real home, not just a showroom. I want you to be the property's administrative manager, with a fair salary, benefits, and most importantly, my unwavering respect and trust." Anna, who had only expected her old job back, was speechless. The offer was more than generosity. It was an act of restitution, a public acknowledgement of her worth and integrity. Accepting was painful, as it meant daily confronting the sight of her greatest humiliation. But as she looked out the window and saw Lara and Theo playing in the garden, she knew it was the right path. The second victory was purer, more thrilling. With Lara's return, the transformation in Theo was almost immediate and miraculous. The color returned to his world. He began to speak more, forming short but clear sentences. He started eating again, smiling. The sound of the two children's laughter echoing through the once silent halls was the sweetest music Richard had ever heard, an emotional return on investment that surpassed any profit his business had ever generated. Their friendship bloomed with renewed strength, stronger for having survived the separation. They no longer had to hide in Theo's room. The garden, the pool, the movie theater, the entire house became their playground. Richard would watch, often from a distance, his heart swelling with a gratitude so intense it almost hurt. He saw how Lara patiently taught Theo to swim, how they created elaborate stories with their toys, how she understood the moments he needed silence. She was the key that unlocked his son's world, and he, in his arrogance, had almost thrown her away. The final victory, however, was the most transformative and unexpected. Richard, wanting to offer Lara the very best in gratitude, enrolled her in the same elite private school that Theo was meant to attend but rarely participated in. To everyone's surprise, with Lara by his side in class, Theo began to thrive. Her presence was his anchor, his safe harbor, allowing him to venture into social interactions that had once been impossible. The child development specialists were amazed. Theo's progress in a few short weeks surpassed years of intensive therapy. He wasn't cured, but he was connecting, learning, growing in a way no one thought possible. The family dynamic changed radically. They were no longer an employer and an employee living under the same roof. They were a makeshift family, bound not by blood, but by a crisis that had broken them and forced them to rebuild together, stronger and more authentic. The mansion, once a symbol of cold wealth and isolation, was finally becoming a home. 3 weeks. It had been exactly 3 weeks since that rainy morning when Richard had found his son being cared for in a modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood. Looking back, it felt like a lifetime. The man he was before that moment seemed like a stranger, a ghost obsessed with numbers on a screen, blind to the true accounting of life. Now, standing on the veranda of his mansion, he watched the garden bathed in the late afternoon sun. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and blooming roses. But the sweetest sound was the laughter of 2 children coming from the swing hanging on the large oak tree. Lara and Theo were swinging together, trying to touch the sky with their feet. Their joy was so pure, so infectious, that Richard felt a lump form in his throat. It was the picture of peace, the picture of everything that mattered. He had learned his lesson the hardest way possible. He discovered that true fortune wasn't in his bank statements, nor in the price of his shares on the stock exchange, nor in gold bars stored in a vault. Real wealth was right here in this simple moment. It was in the unwavering loyalty of a 7-year-old girl who had risked everything for her friend. It was in the quiet strength of a mother who maintained her dignity in the face of the cruelest injustice. And it was in the recovered smile of his son, a treasure more valuable than his entire inheritance. The journey had been an ordeal, but it had transformed him. He was no longer just a businessman. He was learning to be a father. He started leaving the office earlier, not to escape the silence, but to rush toward the sound. He would sit on the floor to build block towers with the children, even though his always collapsed. He listened to them, truly listened, learning his son's silent language through Lara's patient translation. Lara, the girl who had been cast out under a false accusation, found her place of honor. She hadn't just temporarily lost a friend, she had gained a new life, filled with opportunities her mother could never have dreamed of giving her. But for her, the greatest victory was simple. Theo was happy, and she was by his side. She learned that kindness, even when confronted by malice, has a strength of its own, a resilience that can, in the end, move mountains, or at least the walls of a mansion. Theo, the boy who was lost in the darkness of loneliness, found his way back to the light. He learned that even when words fail, the heart can find a way to communicate. His solo journey through the rainy city wasn't an act of desperation, but the bravest act of his life, a pilgrimage in search of the one person who understood his soul. The mansion, which had witnessed lies, manipulation, and a cruel separation, now breathed with new life. It became a sanctuary for healing, a home where an unlikely family, forged in the fire of adversity, was learning every day that the true foundation of a home isn't capital, but care. Richard looked over at Anna, who joined him on the veranda, carrying 2 cups of tea. They didn't need to speak. They shared a silent understanding, a partnership built on the ruins of a great mistake. Together, they watched the children. The swing went higher and higher, and Theo's laughter was free and clear. In that moment, Richard Ashford, the multimillionaire, understood the final, most profound lesson. Life's greatest lessons don't come from financial consultants or market charts. They come from the pure hearts of children who teach us, with the simplicity of a gesture or a smile, the true meaning of unconditional love.